The first time German soldiers came up against American artillery, it didn't feel like war. It felt like the world was coming apart. The ground shook under their boots, and the thunder just kept rolling. At first some thought it was an air raid, or maybe a freak storm. But they soon realized it was the Americans, hammering them with a storm of shells so relentless it barely felt human. The line between battle and disaster just disappeared. These were men trained to move fast, to strike hard, and then pull back. They'd seen heavy barrages before. On the Eastern Front, Soviet artillery came in wild, crushing waves, but at least there were quiet spells in between. The American way was different. It didn't come in one big hit and then stop. It just kept grinding. Battery after battery, one firing while the next reloaded and resupplied. The Americans kept up a rhythm so steady it felt endless. For the Germans, cowering in their foxholes, the sky wasn't just angry, it was spitting fire non-stop. And then there was the accuracy. That really shook them. German officers wrote home that American shells seemed to fall as if someone was guiding them by hand. This wasn't luck. By the time U.S. troops landed in Europe, they'd built a whole system for this. Fire direction centers using slide rules, plotting boards, and radios to turn a few numbers into pinpoint destruction. A single spotter with binoculars could bring down a storm of shells from miles away, smashing not just bunkers and machine gun nests, but even tanks that happened to be in the wrong place. Once the Americans picked a target, it was only a matter of time. No German position lasted long under that kind of pressure. The psychological toll was brutal. Letters from German soldiers talked about nights without sleep, nerves shot to pieces, and men abandoning their posts. Not because the enemy stormed them, but because they just couldn't take it anymore. American artillery wasn't just breaking bodies, it was breaking minds. What really set the Americans apart, though, wasn't just the number of guns. It was the machine behind them. German troops noticed it right away. The Americans never seemed to run out. Truck convoys rolled up with crate after crate of shells. Batteries fired all day, then swapped out with fresh crews, giving the sense that the supply was endless. That was the true horror. The realization that the United States could do in weeks what Germany couldn't pull off in months. By the time the German high command figured out what they were up against, the old stories about American weakness had collapsed. Nazi propaganda had painted the Americans as soft, hiding behind machines. But when the test came, those machines, powered by an industrial engine bigger than anything in Europe, turned into an avalanche that buried German lines. For the men in gray, huddled in muddy holes, thunder no longer meant rain. It meant the U.S. Army was here, and with them came a storm of shells no one could outrun. Behind every barrage, behind every shaking trench, stood the factories and railroads of an entire continent. When American gunners unleashed hundreds of thousands of rounds, it wasn't luck. It was the result of a production machine the world had never seen. Pennsylvania and Illinois, Michigan and Ohio. They all roared around the clock, stamping out artillery shells by the millions. Assembly lines, once for cars, now fed the war. America had resources Germany couldn't even dream of. Coal from Appalachia, iron from Minnesota, oil from Texas and California, all of it flowing into a network of factories and railroads that stretched coast to coast. By the middle of the war, U.S. industry was cranking out almost half the world's artillery ammunition. The scale was staggering, and for the Germans on the receiving end, it felt endless. Picture this. Tens of millions of shells stacked in crates, loaded onto ships, and sent hurtling across the Atlantic in Liberty ships. Those were launching nearly every single day. Even the guns themselves followed this same make a ton, use a ton mindset. The American 105mm howitzer? That was the Army's workhorse, cranked out in such huge numbers that whole divisions could count on a wall of fire whenever they needed it. The big 105mm guns, famous for their punch, were everywhere, so commanders didn't have to think twice about running low. On the other side, German troops had a very different experience. They watched their ammo, fired only when absolutely sure of a hit, and leaned on smaller guns just to make their supplies last. Then there were the women. All across the U.S., women took over the shell-filling plants, packing explosives, sealing them up, labeling them for the front. It was dangerous, sometimes deadly, But the work carried a sense of purpose. Every shell was a bit of extra safety for someone's son, brother, or husband fighting far from home. By the height of the war, women kept the whole artillery supply chain running, working shifts around the clock. Just getting all these munitions to the front was a massive operation. In England, special depots, hidden under camouflage and guarded by anti-aircraft guns, stockpiled millions of rounds for D-Day. After the landings, the Red Ball Express convoys kept rolling, moving shells over rough roads and makeshift bridges. German spies watched, frustrated. Sabotage, bombing raids. Nothing seemed to slow the endless stream of American shells. To the Germans, it was like the Americans could never run out. No matter how much resistance they threw up, more shells kept coming. What made all of this possible was the tight link between U.S. industry and the battlefield. When an American division called for more shells, the factories back home ramped up production in days. Standardized casings, interchangeable fuses, simple packaging. These little innovations meant ammunition could be shipped and stored without a hitch. After the war, German prisoners talked about their shock at seeing row after row of American ammo boxes stretching off into the distance. The thunder of American guns wasn't just firepower. It was the echo of Detroit's assembly lines, Pittsburgh's steel mills, Chicago's stockyards retooled for war. The sound of a million shells in Europe was really the pulse of American industry at its peak. But having all those shells and guns wasn't enough. Training and doctrine turned firepower into something unstoppable. American artillery crews didn't just know how to shoot. They knew how to work together as part of a machine. Fort Sill, Oklahoma, became the nerve center for this transformation. Soldiers drilled endlessly: math, ballistics, map reading, radio skills. By the time they reached Europe, they could calculate and launch a fire mission in seconds, with deadly accuracy. The real secret weapon? The Fire Direction Center. While other armies let artillery batteries act on their own, the U.S. brought everything together. Forward observers, sometimes right up with the infantry, called in enemy positions by radio. The Fire Direction Center took those calls, did the math, and sent firing data to multiple batteries at once. Suddenly, hundreds of guns could smash a target as if they were a single massive weapon. Tech tipped the scales even further. The Americans had advanced field radios, so observers, direction centers, and gun crews could talk instantly. The Germans mostly had wire telephones, easily cut by shell fire or sabotage. With radios, American artillery adapted fast, shifting fire from one target to the next as the battle changed. To German soldiers on the receiving end, it felt almost supernatural. One moment, a German machine gun nest might seem untouchable, sheltered behind earthworks and hedges. The next, it was erased from the map under a sudden, deafening storm of shells, as if American artillerymen could see through the fog and brush with supernatural precision. This uncanny accuracy wasn't luck. It was the result of relentless American training that emphasized not only marksmanship, but also the need for rapid action and unceasing movement. Every gun crew drilled until they could disassemble, transport, and reassemble their weapons in record time, staying in lockstep with infantry units as front lines shifted unpredictably across the Normandy bocage. In that maze of thick hedgerows and twisting lanes, where visibility was often measured in feet, adaptability was the difference between life and death. American artillerymen became masters of the time-on-target mission, a feat of timing and coordination that required extraordinary discipline. Multiple batteries, sometimes spread miles apart, would calculate and adjust their fire so that shells from every gun landed simultaneously on a single target. For the Germans, this meant an eerie quiet could suddenly erupt into all-consuming chaos. Entire squads or defensive positions were annihilated before anyone could shout a warning or dive for cover. The psychological impact was devastating. German troops described moments when the world seemed to explode around them without the slightest hint of warning, eroding their confidence and sapping their will to fight. Behind the front, the logistics of this artillery onslaught were just as critical as the guns themselves. American crews meticulously tracked ammunition, barrel wear, and fuse settings, treating every shell as a precious resource to be used at the exact right moment. They prepared for every scenario, setting aside high-explosive rounds for bunkers, smoke shells to cover advances, illumination rounds to expose nighttime movements, and armor-piercing shells to counter tanks. This level of preparation meant they could shift tactics instantly in response to changing battlefield conditions. Night after night, American guns fired star shells and flares, turning darkness into daylight, and denying German forces any hope of hiding or regrouping under cover of night. Morale and cohesion underpinned this lethal efficiency. Artillerymen trained, ate, and slept side by side for months before ever seeing combat, forging bonds of trust that became unbreakable under fire. Veterans recalled how the rhythm of loading, aiming, and firing became second nature, a kind of choreography that allowed entire batteries to unleash relentless barrages with little more than a nod or shouted word. In the chaos of battle, each man knew his role so well that they could react instantly, keeping the guns firing even as shells burst around them and enemy counter-battery fire tried to silence their positions. By the time they faced the Wehrmacht in Normandy, these American artillery crews were more than just soldiers. They were highly skilled professionals, as relentless as they were methodical. German officers, many of whom had faced Soviet massed artillery on the Eastern Front, were stunned by the difference. Soviet barrages were legendary for their sheer volume and indiscriminate destruction, but the Americans combined massed firepower with pinpoint targeting and seamless coordination. What looked to outsiders like chaotic violence was actually a carefully orchestrated assault, each calculation and radioed fire order fitting into a larger, meticulously planned operation. When the Allies stormed ashore at Normandy in June 1944, the German defenders prepared for waves of infantry and tanks, relying on their fortified positions and the natural obstacles of the French countryside. They did not expect the scale and intensity of American artillery that followed. After the first day's fighting, as soon as beachheads were established, U.S. commanders made constant fire support their top priority, understanding that their entire advance, indeed their survival, depended upon the guns. Naval artillery provided the opening salvos, but it was the field artillery, rapidly landed and positioned inland, that began to dictate the tempo of battle. What began as support soon became the backbone of the Allied advance, bludgeoning German strongpoints and paving the way for every infantry and armor thrust into the Norman countryside. The Battle for Normandy became a testament to American endurance and firepower. In the fierce, grinding campaigns around places like Caen and Carentan, entire artillery battalions worked around the clock, shifting fire with breathtaking speed to match the fluid advances of infantry and tanks. French villages, transformed into near-impenetrable German fortresses, were smashed to rubble in hours. German intelligence reports described, often with disbelief, how a single American regiment could summon more artillery in support than an entire German division might receive in a major offensive. This overwhelming firepower shattered German morale and made any attempt to hold ground feel futile. No matter how deep they dug or how well they camouflaged their positions, destruction could rain down in minutes, often before they had time to react. German veterans who had survived the hellish barrages on the Eastern Front noted the subtle but crucial differences in American methods. The Soviets relied on brute force, flooding vast areas with shells in hopes of overwhelming defenders. The Americans, by contrast, aimed their fire with surgical precision. Near St. Lo, American forward observers methodically hunted for concealed bunkers hidden in orchards and hedgerows, calling in perfectly timed strikes that destroyed each in turn. To the men cowering inside, it felt as if an unseen hand was pointing them out individually for obliteration, deepening a sense of helplessness and inevitability. The Germans also came to appreciate, sometimes with awe and sometimes with despair, the sheer scale of the American supply machine. Prisoners spoke of stumbling upon Allied supply dumps filled with mountains of shells, stacked higher than a man, and stretching along the lanes and fields as far as the eye could see. While the Wehrmacht rationed every shell and often ceased firing to preserve precious ammunition, American batteries pounded away at any target, no matter how small, seemingly without concern for cost. Even a lone sniper or isolated machine gun nest could expect to be buried under a deluge of fire. This abundance signaled to the Germans that they were not merely fighting another army, but the full might of an industrial superpower, capable of sustaining this intensity day after day. Desperate to stem the tide, German commanders ordered counter-battery fire, trying to silence the American guns and reclaim the initiative. But the scale, coordination, and relentless tempo of American artillery had already shifted the balance. The Germans found themselves outmaneuvered not just by superior numbers or technology, but by an enemy whose training, organization, and logistics allowed them to bring down the hammer of war with unerring speed and accuracy. The very landscape of Normandy, once a defensive ally, became a killing ground shaped by American firepower, a reality that would echo across northern France as the Allies pressed deeper into occupied territory. The thunder of American artillery wasn't just the background noise of battle, it was the driving force behind the Allied victory in the West. U.S. artillery crews operated with a doctrine built around rapid movement and adaptability. Mobility wasn't just a tactic, it was a mindset drilled into every battery. The moment an enemy barrage ceased, American gun crews sprang into action, breaking down their positions and relocating before German counter-battery fire could even adjust. The result was that when German shells finally fell, they landed on empty ground, wasting precious ammunition and leaving the American guns untouched and ready to fire again. This nimble approach was supercharged by technology. The Americans deployed advanced radar and sound-ranging systems, allowing them to pinpoint the origin of enemy gunfire after a single salvo. Armed with this real-time intelligence, U.S. batteries unleashed devastating counterfire, swamping German positions in a torrent of shells before the enemy could react or reposition. It was a contest not just of men, but of machines and innovation, a technological arms race where the Americans held the clear advantage. Their supply lines were robust, radios crackled with fast, clear communication, and their ammunition reserves seemed bottomless compared to their German adversaries. In this evolving battlefield, speed of response and volume of fire became decisive. Nowhere was this clearer than during the brutal fighting on the Cotton-Tan Peninsula. Here, German forces threw themselves repeatedly against the American lines, aiming to drive them back into the sea. Each assault, however, was anticipated and neutralized before it could develop. American artillery had already registered every likely approach, roads, bridges, open fields, and transformed them into deadly kill zones. When German columns advanced, they were caught in a withering crossfire, torn apart before they had any hope of engaging the American infantry. Survivors described the terror and helplessness of seeing entire units obliterated by unseen guns, the threat lurking over every horizon. This relentless pounding broke more than just attacks. It broke German confidence. Soon, their officers abandoned any hope of daytime maneuvers in sectors where American artillery was active, a zone that, by mid-campaign, encompassed nearly the entire front. It was a silent admission of defeat before the fighting even began. By the time the campaign in Normandy drew to a close, German commanders recognized a hard truth. American artillery was not a mere supporting arm. It was the battle's deciding force, the hammer that shattered counterattacks before they formed, demolished fortified strongpoints, and maintained an unrelenting pressure that made even holding ground feel impossible. The thunder that began on D-Day only grew in intensity, echoing deeper into France as the Allies advanced. The psychological toll was immense, with German letters home describing the constant anxiety and exhaustion of living under ceaseless bombardment, never knowing when the next storm of steel would descend. Following the chaos of the beach landings, the fighting shifted into the bocage, the infamous Norman hedgerows. This countryside, with its maze of sunken lanes and thick, high hedges, was tailor-made for defensive warfare. To the Germans, it was a gift, perfect cover for ambushes, machine guns hidden behind walls of green, anti-tank teams lurking at crossroads, and mortars nestled in orchards. They expected these tangled defenses to bleed the Americans dry, forcing them into slow, costly advances, where every yard was paid for in blood. Yet it was here that American artillery again tipped the scales. The bocage was a nightmare for tanks and infantry, who found themselves bottlenecked in narrow lanes, easy prey for German ambushes. Direct fire was often ineffective. Hedges absorbed bullets and shells, and defenders melted away before they could be hit. But American gunners adapted quickly, modifying their tactics for this unique terrain. They learned to employ high-angle fire, arcing shells over the hedgerows, to flush out hidden defenders and destroy positions thought untouchable. Mortar crews worked in tandem with heavy artillery, saturating target areas with overlapping barrages that cleared one field after another. The effectiveness of this approach hinged on the skill and daring of artillery observers. These men climbed into church towers, risking sniper fire, or took to the skies in light aircraft like the L-4 Grasshopper. From above, they could see over the hedges, relay precise coordinates, and direct fire with uncanny accuracy. German soldiers came to fear these flying eyes, knowing that the slightest movement could bring a rain of destruction. For the American infantry slogging forward through the green labyrinth, it felt as if every enemy position had already been marked, like the gunners held a secret map of the battlefield drawn from the sky. The scale of American firepower in the bocage was staggering. Some divisions fired over 10,000 rounds in a single day. Any place the Germans might gather, crossroads, assembly points, even seemingly empty fields, was preemptively shelled, denying them any chance to regroup or counterattack. The Germans soon realized that strong points were simply death traps waiting to be discovered. Many positions were abandoned not after being assaulted, but at the first sign that artillery had them in its sights. The hedgerows that had promised safety became cages, trapping their defenders under relentless bombardment. As the campaign progressed, American tactics evolved further. Rolling barrages, artillery fire that crept forward in sync with advancing infantry, became a lifeline in the bocage's restricted visibility. This technique stunned and disoriented German defenders, who were unable to recover or organize counterattacks before U.S. troops were upon them. Captured German officers later admitted that the close coordination between artillery and infantry left their men reeling, unable to mount any effective resistance. The devastation caused by this firepower extended far beyond the front lines. Villages that had stood for centuries were obliterated, reduced to fields of rubble by the pounding. For Norman civilians, American artillery was a two-edged sword. It delivered them from occupation, but at the price of their homes, their history, and often their livelihoods. The landscape itself was transformed, scarred by shell craters and shattered buildings, a testament to the ferocity of the campaign. Morale among German troops steadily eroded under the weight of this onslaught. Letters intercepted by Allied intelligence revealed a mounting sense of despair. Men spoke of the nerve-shredding anxiety of waiting for barrages that could come at any moment, of the impossibility of rest, and of the sense that survival was a matter of luck rather than skill. For many it felt as if they were living beneath a hammer pounded relentlessly, with no reprieve in sight. The American artillery, in its sheer power and persistence, not only shaped the course of battle, it shaped the very experience of war itself for those caught beneath its shadow. By July, the bocage, once a tangled natural fortress, wasn't so impenetrable anymore. American commanders had figured out how to turn those hedgerows into traps, using artillery to strip away the Germans' home field advantage. The lesson for the Germans? Brutal. No matter how well they hid, no matter how clever their defenses, the endless pounding from American shells kept grinding them down. The hedges slowed the Allies, sure, but they never stopped them. Each day brought another barrage, another chunk of the German line falling apart. By the end of July 1944, the Allies were ready to break out of hedge country for good. Operation Cobra wasn't just another offensive. It was a masterclass in American firepower. Everybody talks about the carpet bombing that opened the attack, but honestly, what came next was just as fierce. The relentless, coordinated fury of American artillery. German positions didn't just crumble, they disappeared in a storm of steel and panic. The real goal was to smash the German 7th Army and the Panzer Lehr Division, both dug in south of St. Lo. The Americans went all in. Artillery planners gathered more guns and shells than anyone had ever seen. Hundreds of batteries lined up, tens of thousands of rounds stacked and ready. Fire direction centers made sure whole regiments could unleash hell at once. Soldiers had a phrase for it, steel rain, and this time it wasn't a metaphor. Shells fell in sheets, tearing up the ground, splintering bunkers, erasing anything that looked like cover. One of the most impressive things about Cobra was the timing. Heavy bombers would smash the first line, then, before the Germans could even catch their breath, American guns opened up, pinning everyone in place. Unlike earlier, when barrages were scattered and short-lived, this was a steady, layered assault. High explosives to blast defenses, smoke shells to blind counterattacks, air bursts to shower anyone hiding in ditches or foxholes. German survivors said nowhere felt safe. Not the bunkers, not the woods, not the fields. For the Panzer Lehr Division, one of the German army's best, Cobra was a disaster. Their vehicles got caught in the narrow lanes, perfect targets for coordinated artillery strikes. Convoys broke apart before they could even mount a counterattack. Tanks and half-tracks didn't get knocked out in epic duels. They were stranded by shattered bridges, cratered roads, and burning fuel trucks. By the time Cobra was done, Panzer Lehr was just a battered remnant, its survivors retreating in chaos. A big breakthrough during Cobra was the use of time-on-target missions. Spotters made sure shells from distant batteries all landed together, so Germans had no warning, just a sudden, shattering explosion, and then another, and then hundreds more. This kind of shock made it impossible to organize any real resistance. The scale was wild. In the first few days, some American divisions fired over 100,000 shells. The Red Ball Express kept the guns loaded, roaring up and down the roads, making sure the barrage never let up. Whole villages, crossroads, and assembly points vanished under the bombardment. German officers couldn't even reach their men. Radios cut out, vehicles wrecked, orders lost in the chaos. Once the German front collapsed under the artillery assault, American tanks and infantry poured through the gap into open country. Later, German soldiers admitted it wasn't the tanks or the men that broke them. It was the relentless shell fire. Artillery did the real work, smashing defenses and morale so completely that holding out turned into a desperate scramble for survival. After Cobra, American artillery became legendary. German commanders saw they weren't just outnumbered, they were hopelessly outgunned. What started as a slow grind in the hedges turned into a tidal wave of firepower, something no defensive line could hope to stop. For the Wehrmacht, Operation Cobra proved that American guns weren't just plentiful, they were the deciding factor. As the Allies surged east in the fall of 1944, they carried that momentum right up to Germany's doorstep. The Germans called it the West Wall, but most people know it as the Siegfried Line, a chain of bunkers, pillboxes, and tank traps that ran for hundreds of miles. For years, German propaganda bragged about its strength. This was supposed to be the last unbreakable shield guarding the Reich. But when the Allies finally arrived, it wasn't just brave infantry that broke through. American artillery did most of the heavy lifting. U.S. commanders faced a nightmare. This wasn't like the open fields in France. The Siegfried Line cut through thick forests, steep hills, and towns that bristled with machine guns. Charging straight at it looked like suicide. So the Americans let their guns lead the way. Before every attack, gunners hammered the German positions with barrage after barrage, not just smashing bunkers but ripping up roads and cutting off supply lines. By the time the infantry moved up, the ground behind the line was a wasteland. Roads cratered, ammo dumps burning, German reinforcements scattered before they could even reach the front. What really rattled the Germans was the never-ending rain of shells. Day and night the ground shook. Trenches caved in. The sky whistled with shrapnel. And nobody could tell when one bombardment ended and the next started. Prisoners later said it felt endless. American crews worked around the clock. As soon as one battery started to flag, another took over. Fresh ammunition kept coming, even as barrels wore out and needed swapping. Technology cranked the pressure even higher. In the forests around Hürtgen, American sound-ranging gear and counter-battery radar meant any German gun that dared open fire was spotted and hit within minutes. Crews either ran or took their chances and got wiped out. By then, German gunners, who once took pride in their skill, started losing their nerve. Some scribbled in their diaries about the Americans' endless firepower. "They always shoot longer, harder, and more accurately," one wrote bitterly. It all came to a head in the battle for Aachen in October. This was the first big German city the Allies attacked, and the symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. American artillery hammered the city day and night, flattening buildings and grinding defenses to dust before the tanks and infantry rolled in. German troops trying to reinforce Aachen never made it. They got caught in pre-planned kill zones and cut to pieces. One officer said being in Aachen was like living under a waterfall of iron. For civilians trapped inside the border towns, the bombardment was terrifying. They'd been told the West Wall would protect them. Instead, they watched their neighborhoods vanish under weeks of shell fire. Propaganda kept insisting Germany would hold, but the truth played out in broken concrete and fields pitted with craters. The Siegfried Line wasn't falling to bayonet charges. It was getting torn apart, foot by relentless artillery that left nothing standing. By the end of it, German commanders had to face facts. Their famous defensive belt was just slowing the inevitable. American firepower showed everyone that no wall, no matter how tough, could stand against endless shells and skilled gunners. What was supposed to prove German strength turned into a monument to exhaustion. The Reich's heartland was wide open, just waiting for the storm that had already smashed through Normandy and France. By late 1944, American artillery was at its peak. Back in Normandy, it started as support fire. Now it was the main event, crushing German resistance wherever it popped up. As the Allies pushed to the Rhine and beyond, U.S. guns fired millions of rounds in a few weeks, completely overwhelming anything the Wehrmacht could throw back. The last months of the war made it crystal clear. This non-stop barrage broke the back of Nazi Germany. During the Battle of the Bulge, Germany's last big gamble, American artillery proved just as important as the men with rifles or the tanks. When German panzers surged into the Ardennes in December 1944, they made gains at first, but the American response was swift and brutal. The forests lit up as hidden batteries rained shells on the advancing columns. Tanks weren't just blown up. They got stranded when bridges and supply convoys vanished under the shell fire at Bastogne. The surrounded U.S. paratroopers managed to hold out partly because artillery from nearby units hammered German positions non-stop. That steady crash of shells was the one thing that told the men help was actually coming. By early 1945, when American armies pushed over the Rhine, the sheer size of these bombardments was staggering. Sometimes, over 1,000 guns opened up at once for a single fire mission. During one infamous barrage along the Ruhr, American guns fired over 1 million shells in just a few weeks. Factories, rail yards, defensive lines, all smashed to pieces. German officers later admitted their troops went into battle already half-beaten. Morale just collapsed under that kind of onslaught. They knew no counterattack would survive. All those famous German fortifications, all that engineering, didn't matter much when supply lines got wiped out before new units could even reach the front. The Rhine crossing itself showed just how much artillery shaped the fight. Massive barrages flattened everything on the far bank. Smoke shells rolled in, hiding engineers as they built pontoon bridges. As soon as those bridges went up, the guns shifted fire deeper into Germany, cutting off reinforcements and trapping frontline units. The Americans took those crossings so fast, the German command barely had time to react. They'd counted on the river to stop the Allies, but artillery turned it into just another obstacle, nothing more. Even cities that fought back hard couldn't stand up to that level of firepower. In Cologne, and later at the Ruhr Pocket, American guns tore apart urban defenses with grim precision. Strong points reduced to rubble, but key roads left open for the infantry to push through. German soldiers, already short on fuel, food, and ammo, got shelled until they surrendered. Some said afterward that it wasn't just their bunkers that got destroyed. It was their will to fight too. The numbers were jaw-dropping. By the end of the war, the U.S. had fired off more artillery shells than any army in history. American divisions sometimes shot off more rounds in a week than Germany could make in a month. Supply depots overflowed with shells. Nobody ran out. But it wasn't just sheer numbers. It was how the Americans kept that pace going, week after week, backed by a supply system that seemed bottomless. In those last months, German soldiers who once sneered at American troops now talked about U.S. artillery with real fear. They felt like the guns were everywhere, answering every move, crushing every hope of resistance. So when Germany finally fell in May 1945, it wasn't just tanks rolling through shattered streets or soldiers raising flags. It was the echo of millions of shells, a thunder rolling over the ruins, a final reminder that industrial firepower had changed war forever.